The dog refused to leave the edge of the collapsed mine, even after everyone else had decided the man below was already dead. A sharp crack echoed through the darkness as another chunk of rock slammed into the flooded tunnel. Wyatt couldn't feel his left arm anymore. Dust coated his tongue, and somewhere ahead, Atlas kept barking at a wall no map had ever marked. Then the barking stopped, replaced by the scrape of paws digging through stone toward something hidden for 100 years. The old Ford pickup rattled over another stretch of cracked mountain road, its suspension groaning with every rut carved into the earth. The windshield was streaked with dust from 3 states, and the faded army duffel strapped behind the seat had not been unpacked in nearly 4 years. Wyatt Brennan had stopped pretending he was traveling somewhere. The truck had become the closest thing he had to a home. Atlas sat in the passenger seat with the quiet dignity only an old German shepherd seemed capable of carrying. His amber eyes never wandered for long. They moved from the tree line to the road ahead, then briefly to Wyatt before returning to their silent watch. They had developed that rhythm together over countless nights, sleeping beneath abandoned overpasses, in empty rest areas, or tucked behind forgotten gas stations where no one asked questions. The GPS on Wyatt's phone had lost its signal nearly 20 miles back. He didn't need it anymore. One weathered wooden sign remained beside the narrow road. Black Creek, population 612. Someone had painted over the bottom half years ago. Another rusted sign leaned crooked beneath it. Warning: abandoned mining district. No public access. Wyatt barely glanced at it. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel instead. Not because of the sign, because silence like this always reminded him of Afghanistan. Too quiet. Too still. His eyes automatically swept the ridgelines. Tree line, old fence, collapsed shed, possible observation point. Without realizing it, he counted distances the way rangers were trained to do. 300 yards, 600, dead ground between the hills. Habit had long ago replaced conscious thought. Atlas suddenly lifted his nose. The dog sniffed once, then settled again. Easy, buddy, Wyatt murmured. His own voice sounded unfamiliar after hours without speaking. The folded envelope resting beside the gear shift caught his attention. The return address belonged to a law office in Asheville. Inside was the only inheritance Wyatt Brennan had ever received. 37 acres. One abandoned parcel bordering the old Black Creek mine. Owner: Thomas Brennan. Relationship: grandfather. Estimated value: minimal. The attorney had delivered the news without ceremony. Most people around there think it's worthless. Worthless. Wyatt almost laughed when he'd heard the word. He'd spent years being called the same thing after leaving the army. The road curved around a rocky ridge before opening into a broad valley surrounded by hardwood forest. There it was. His land. The weeds reached nearly waist-high. Broken fence posts leaned at odd angles. The remains of an old logging trail disappeared into the trees. Farther back, hidden beneath vines and brush, stood the weathered remains of a mining office that looked ready to collapse under its own memories. No house, no electricity, no mailbox. Nothing anyone would want. Wyatt stepped from the truck. The mountain air smelled of pine needles, wet earth, and rust. Atlas climbed out beside him and stretched, before beginning his slow inspection of the property, nose close to the ground. Wyatt unfolded the faded survey map. His grandfather had once scribbled a single sentence across the bottom in shaky handwriting. Some things are only worthless until someone finally looks close enough. He traced the words with his thumb. A black SUV rolled silently onto the clearing. Wyatt heard the engine before he turned. The vehicle stopped only 20 feet away. A tall man in an expensive work jacket stepped out first. Late 50s, clean boots, too clean, the kind of boots that never touched real mud. Two younger men remained near the vehicle. Neither smiled. "You Wyatt Brennan?" Wyatt nodded once. "You must be Preston Hale." The man's eyebrows lifted. "So you've heard of me?" "Only from the attorney." Preston smiled politely. "The attorney tell you this place is a headache?" "No." He should have. He looked across the overgrown land as though discussing someone else's mistake. "My family's managed these mountains for decades." "Managed?" "Protected." Wyatt said nothing. Silence often made people reveal more than questions ever could. Preston reached into his coat and produced an envelope. $50,000. Wyatt looked at it without moving. Cash. Still nothing. "It's generous," Wyatt finally spoke. "If it's worthless." He looked across the property. "Why are you offering 50 grand? For the first time, Preston's smile faltered. "A favor. I don't need one. You don't even know what's out here." "I was about to find out." The mountain breeze shifted. Atlas wandered back without being called. He stood beside Wyatt, ears forward, watching Preston, watching the two men, not barking, just watching. Preston sighed. "Listen carefully." His voice lost every trace of warmth. "Those old mines aren't safe. I noticed. People disappear out here." Wyatt met his eyes. "So I've heard." A long silence settled between them. Finally, Preston slipped the envelope back into his jacket. "You've got until tomorrow morning." "For what?" "To make the smart decision." The SUV rolled away, disappearing between the trees. Atlas remained perfectly still. Wyatt watched until the dust settled. Only then did he exhale. Military instinct whispered quietly inside him. Too easy. Nobody offered $50,000 for 37 useless acres, not unless they already knew something he didn't. That evening, Wyatt parked beside the old mining office. He built no fire, cooked nothing. Light discipline had become second nature years ago. Atlas finished eating first before lying beside the truck. Darkness settled quickly beneath the Appalachian canopy. Somewhere far away, an owl called. Leaves rustled. Wind moved through the pines. Then, nothing. Wyatt lay inside the truck, fully dressed. Boots still on, knife beneath the seat, one hand resting near the flashlight. Sleep never arrived all at once anymore. It came in short, fragile pieces. A sharp crack echoed somewhere in the woods. Not loud, just a branch. His eyes opened instantly. No confusion, no hesitation, only training. His breathing slowed. He listened. 30 seconds, 1 minute, another faint sound. Footsteps, too careful to belong to deer. Atlas never barked. The German shepherd slowly stood, every muscle tightened beneath his dark coat. His ears locked toward the tree line. Then the low growl came, barely louder than the wind, but Wyatt had learned long ago. Atlas never growled without a reason. He stayed perfectly still inside the cab, slowing his breathing until it nearly matched the whisper of the wind moving through the pines. In Afghanistan, movement often gave away a position long before sound did. Patience had kept men alive. Tonight, it might do the same. Another footstep. Soft. Measured. Not an animal. Atlas shifted his weight without taking his eyes off the darkness beyond the clearing. His hackles rose along his shoulders, but he remained silent, waiting for Wyatt the way he always had. Wyatt eased the flashlight into his pocket instead of switching it on. Light could blind the man holding it far more effectively than the one hiding beyond it. He slipped quietly from the truck, keeping the engine block between himself and the tree line. Nothing. Only towering oaks swaying beneath a moon hidden behind clouds. His gaze swept naturally across the terrain. Fence. Collapsed mining shack. Large boulder. Shadow. Wait. The shadow moved. Only a fraction. Enough. Atlas, Wyatt whispered. The dog immediately circled behind him without hesitation. The movement in the trees stopped. Silence settled once more. Too complete. Wyatt disliked silence that suddenly became perfect. His pulse remained calm, but every muscle tightened. Contact was coming. He could feel it. Then came the smell. Fresh cigarette smoke. Not strong. Just enough. Someone was closer than they realized. Atlas's ears snapped toward the old mining office. Wyatt followed the dog's line of sight. A metallic click. Barely audible. Safety coming off. His body reacted before conscious thought caught up. Move! Atlas lunged sideways the same instant Wyatt dove behind the remains of an old stone foundation. Something heavy crashed through the truck windshield. Glass exploded across the seats. Not a gunshot. A steel pipe. A distraction. Boots thundered across the clearing. 3, maybe 4 men. Wyatt rolled to one knee, grabbing a broken fence rail as the first attacker rushed him. The man swung wildly. Wyatt stepped inside the arc, driving an elbow into the attacker's ribs before shoving him backward. Another came from the left. Professional spacing. They weren't fighting like drunks. Someone had drilled them. Atlas exploded from the darkness. His powerful body slammed into one attacker's chest, knocking the man flat before he could reach Wyatt. The dog didn't bite. He pinned, controlled, exactly as Wyatt had trained him. A flashlight beam swept across the clearing. "Take the dog!" someone shouted. Another man emerged carrying a heavy wooden club. Atlas released his target and turned. The club swung. It struck the ground inches from his shoulder. The German shepherd twisted away with impossible speed. Wyatt reached Atlas first. "Break!" Atlas instantly backed off. They retreated together toward the abandoned office. Not panic. Movement. Always keep moving. Always deny the enemy an easy angle. It had been years since Wyatt thought in Ranger terms. Tonight they returned effortlessly. Clear left. Check high ground. Watch the flank. His heartbeat remained steady. His mind did not. A sudden burst of light flashed through the trees. For one impossible second. It wasn't Appalachia anymore. It was Helmand Province. Dust, fire, the violent white flash of a mortar impact. Someone screaming over the radio. "Medic! Medic!" Wyatt blinked. The memory vanished. Only darkness remained. But that single hesitation cost him. Something slammed into the back of his head. Pain erupted across his skull. His knees buckled. Atlas barked. Not once. Twice. Sharp. Urgent. Wyatt stumbled forward, trying to regain balance. Another blow struck his shoulder. Hands grabbed his jacket. Too many. Someone drove a knee into his back. He hit the ground hard. A boot planted itself against his spine. He fought to rise. Couldn't. A familiar voice drifted through the darkness. "Enough." Preston Hale stepped into the clearing, adjusting leather gloves as calmly as if inspecting cattle. "I told you this mountain wasn't for you." Blood trickled into Wyatt's right eye. "You could have just walked away." Wyatt managed a tired smile. "You offered too much." Preston sighed. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice that." One of the men handed him the folded property papers. Preston looked them over before slipping them inside his coat. "My family's worked very hard to keep this place forgotten." Wyatt stared at him. "What are you hiding?" Preston crouched beside him. "Nothing you'll live long enough to understand." He nodded once. The men dragged Wyatt across the rocky ground. Atlas charged. A flashlight smashed against the dog's side, sending him tumbling into brush. "Atlas!" The German shepherd disappeared into the darkness. No bark, no movement, only silence. Wyatt's chest tightened. Had they killed him? Or had Atlas finally done what every survival instinct demanded? Run. The men hauled Wyatt toward a section of forest where the ground suddenly opened beneath the trees. Moonlight revealed the edge of an enormous mining shaft swallowed by vines and decades of neglect. Its walls disappeared into blackness. Cold air drifted upward from somewhere impossibly deep below. One attacker laughed nervously. "I still hate this hole." Preston never looked down. They'll never find him. Wyatt tried planting his boots. A rifle stock struck his ribs. Air fled his lungs. For one heartbeat, he looked toward the woods. No Atlas. Only darkness. He closed his eyes. Not from surrender. From memory. He remembered another night. Another extraction point. Another friend who never climbed back aboard the helicopter. Survivor's guilt settled over him like old rain. Then hands shoved him. The earth vanished beneath his feet. Branches whipped across his face. Stones scraped flesh from his arms. He struck one rocky ledge, then another. Pain exploded through his side. The world spun end over end. Above him, the circle of moonlight grew smaller, 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 until everything became weightless. Then, impact. The force drove every breath from his body. He couldn't move, couldn't think. Dust filled his mouth. Somewhere high above, loose rocks rattled down the shaft. For one terrifying second. The sound became incoming mortar rounds again. He curled instinctively, covering his head exactly as he'd done years before beneath another sky. When the echoes finally died, nothing remained. Only darkness. Only silence. Only the slow drip of water somewhere beyond the reach of the light. Wyatt lay motionless, staring into darkness so complete it seemed to press against his eyes. Every breath came shallow, each one scraping against the sharp pain beneath his ribs. His left shoulder refused to move without sending another wave of fire through his chest. He stayed where he was. Not because he wanted to. Because Army Rangers learned early that the first man to move after an explosion often discovered a second one waiting. He counted slowly. 1, 2, 3. By the time he reached 60, his breathing had settled. No broken neck. His fingers moved, then his toes. His right leg answered immediately. His left did too, though slower. Good. He rolled carefully onto one elbow and waited for the dizziness to pass. The shaft stretched upward farther than he had imagined. Moonlight filtered through a jagged opening hundreds of feet above, no wider than a silver coin. No voices, no footsteps. Preston's men were gone. They believed the mountain had finished the job. Wyatt pushed himself against the stone wall. His hand came away wet. Not blood. Water. He frowned. The abandoned mine was supposed to be dry. At least that's what every warning sign outside had claimed. Another drop struck the rock beside his boot. Then another. Drip. Drip. His canteen was gone. His backpack. His phone. Everything except the clothes he wore and the folding knife still clipped inside his pocket, overlooked in the darkness. He caught another drop with trembling fingers and brought it to his lips. Cold. Fresh. Real. Enough to keep him thinking. Not enough to survive long. He tilted his head. The dripping wasn't echoing from above. It came from somewhere deeper. His military training quietly took over. Never chase hope. Follow evidence. He tore a strip from the sleeve of his flannel shirt and wrapped it tightly around his bruised ribs before testing his weight. Pain. Manageable. He limped toward the faint sound. Every few yards he stopped. listened, observed. The tunnel walls carried black streaks where moisture had seeped through stone for generations. Old timber supports leaned at dangerous angles, their surfaces silvered with age. Rusted rails disappeared beneath loose gravel. Someone had built this place. Someone had worked here, then abandoned it. A sudden crack echoed overhead. Wyatt froze instantly. His body lowered without thought, eyes upward, searching. The sound wasn't another attack, only rotten wood settling after decades underground. Still, his heartbeat refused to slow. For one fractured second, the sharp crack became rifle fire across a distant Afghan hillside. He smelled diesel, burned rubber, hot dust. He heard Sergeant Miller shouting over the radio, "Move! Move!" Then Atlas nudged his hand. The memory shattered. Wyatt opened his eyes. Nothing but darkness. He swallowed hard. "You're losing it," he whispered to himself. No answer came. Only another drip. He followed it around a bend. The tunnel narrowed until he had to turn sideways between jagged folds. Then, something impossible. Fresh paw prints. Large, deep, German shepherd. His pulse surged. Atlas? Silence. He crouched. The prints weren't old. Moist earth still clung to their edges. The dog had been here. A rough bark echoed somewhere ahead. Faint, almost swallowed by stone. Wyatt laughed despite the pain. "You stubborn fool." The sound came again, closer. Atlas appeared from the darkness at a full run, ears back, eyes bright. The German shepherd nearly knocked Wyatt off his feet before stopping just short, pressing his muzzle against Wyatt's chest as if making certain he was real. Wyatt buried trembling fingers into the thick fur around the dog's neck. "I thought—" His voice failed him. Atlas whined softly. Only then did Wyatt notice dirt packed beneath the dog's claws. The fur across his shoulders was dusty. His nose was covered with fresh clay. "You've been digging." Atlas stepped away, looked back, then barked once. Short, commanding, not excitement, instruction. Wyatt recognized the behavior immediately, the same signal Atlas used during search and rescue exercises years ago. "Follow me." The dog trotted deeper into the tunnel, pausing every few yards to make sure Wyatt remained behind him. The air gradually changed, cooler, damp. It carried the unmistakable smell of wet earth hidden beneath layers of ancient stone. Wyatt's flashlight was gone, but enough pale light filtered through cracks high above to reveal faint shapes. Atlas suddenly stopped beside what looked like nothing more than a collapsed wall of broken rock. He began digging furiously. Loose stones scattered across the tunnel floor. Dust filled the air. "What is it?" Atlas ignored the question. His paws moved faster. One claw scraped against something that wasn't stone. Brick. Wyatt knelt beside him. Half buried beneath rubble stood an old brick partition unlike anything else in the mine. Its mortar had crumbled with age. Someone had sealed this section deliberately. He pulled out his folding knife and scraped away loose dirt. The bricks were handmade, far older than the concrete supports elsewhere in the mine. Atlas focused on one narrow crack near the bottom. Cold air drifted through it, enough to stir the loose hair on Wyatt's wrist. A hidden space. His exhaustion vanished beneath a surge of curiosity. Together they pulled away loose stones one by one. Atlas worked with relentless determination despite bleeding claws. Finally, one brick shifted, then another. The opening widened until Wyatt could shine a sliver of gray daylight through the gap. He leaned closer. Beyond the wall, there wasn't another tunnel. There was a room no survey map had ever mentioned. and resting just inside the darkness sat the corner of an old steel lockbox coated in nearly a century of dust. Wyatt remained crouched, one hand against the cracked brick wall, while Atlas continued pulling loose stones away with determined strokes of his bleeding paws. The opening widened just enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Cold air drifted from the hidden chamber. Not the stale air of an abandoned tunnel. This air carried the scent of damp cedar, rusted iron, and old paper. Someone had sealed this room. Someone had wanted it forgotten. Wyatt brushed the last loose brick aside and eased himself through the narrow gap. Every movement reminded him of the bruises spreading beneath his shirt, but curiosity pushed him farther than pain ever could. Atlas slipped inside immediately behind him. The chamber was surprisingly intact. Unlike the mine outside, the ceiling here had been reinforced with thick oak beams that had somehow survived the passing decades. A single ventilation shaft, no wider than a stovepipe, reached somewhere toward the mountainside above, allowing faint daylight to spill across the room in pale ribbons. Dust floated lazily through the narrow beams of light. Nothing had disturbed this place for generations. Along one wall stood shelves built from rough-cut chestnut lumber. Most had collapsed. A few still held glass bottles, rusted lanterns, mining helmets, and leather-bound notebooks whose covers had curled with age. Near the center of the room sat the steel lockbox Wyatt had first noticed. Beside it rested a long wooden crate stamped with faded black lettering. Black Creek Mining Company, property of the Engineering Office, 1924. Wyatt slowly knelt. His fingers brushed across the lock. Corrosion had eaten away nearly every moving part. One careful strike with the handle of his folding knife snapped the weakened latch. The lid groaned open. Inside lay neatly folded survey maps wrapped in oilcloth, bundles of handwritten documents tied with cotton string, property deeds, engineering drawings, a leather journal. Everything had been packed with deliberate care, not hidden in panic. Preserved. Atlas wandered quietly around the chamber. His nose moved from shelf to shelf before stopping near another section of brickwork along the far wall. He scratched once, then twice, not digging this time, pointing. Wyatt glanced over but returned to the journal first. Its cracked leather cover bore a faded name pressed into the surface. Elias Mercer, Chief Mining Engineer, Black Creek Mine. Wyatt carefully opened the first page. The ink had faded but remained readable. If these records are ever found, then I have failed to stop what Preston Hale's grandfather intends to do. Wyatt frowned. Hale. The name reached backward through time. He turned another page. Survey sketches, groundwater diagrams, lists of worker names, production figures. Then entire paragraphs crossed out in angry black ink. Further inside, the handwriting changed. It became hurried, uneven. The North Tunnel cannot hold another blast. The men know something is wrong. Management ordered us to proceed anyway. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He had seen reports written like this before. Not in mines. On military incident reviews. Warnings ignored. Lives treated as acceptable losses. Atlas whined softly. Wyatt looked up. The dog stood rigid before the second wall, ears forward, his nose pressed against a narrow crack. There too? Atlas pawed the floor once. Wyatt walked over. The mortar around these bricks looked newer than the rest. Not much newer. Perhaps only a few weeks after the first wall had been sealed. Whoever built this chamber had hidden something twice. He examined the floor instead. Fresh scratches. No, not fresh, simply protected from weather. Long parallel grooves crossed the stone. Something heavy had once been dragged toward this wall. The realization settled quietly. The chamber wasn't meant to store treasure. It was an archive. Evidence. He turned back toward the shelves. Inside one canvas satchel, he found rolled property surveys bearing official county seals. Another contained dozens of payroll records. Several pages listed families living around Black Creek before the mine disaster. One name caught his attention: Thomas Brennan, his grandfather. Not as owner, as witness. Wyatt stared at the page. His grandfather had been only a young survey assistant at the time, so why had he been connected to records hidden inside a secret chamber? A sudden wave of dizziness swept through him. He grabbed the shelf to steady himself. His vision blurred. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. His body had burned through every reserve, climbing, crawling, surviving. Atlas immediately moved to his side, pressing his shoulder gently against Wyatt's leg. "I'm all right." The words sounded weaker than he intended. He wasn't. The room tilted again. He reached into the lockbox one final time before everything became indistinct. At the very bottom lay a small cloth pouch. Inside were several dull yellow stones. Not polished. Not stacked like pirate treasure. Raw assay samples. Each no larger than a walnut. Worth something. But nowhere near enough to explain murder. Wyatt almost smiled. So it wasn't the gold. His eyes drifted back toward the journal. It was never the gold. His knees finally gave way. He collapsed against the wall before sliding slowly onto the cold stone floor. Atlas barked once, sharp, urgent. The German shepherd nudged Wyatt's shoulder. No response. He licked Wyatt's face. Still nothing. The dog's breathing quickened. He circled twice, whining deep in his throat. Then he made a decision. Atlas looked once toward the scattered journals, once toward his unconscious partner, then toward the narrow passage leading back into the abandoned mine. Without another sound, he sprinted into the darkness. The echoes of his paws faded deeper into the tunnel until only silence remained. Far above the mountain, morning sunlight spilled across the forgotten forests of Appalachia. No one in Black Creek noticed the lone German shepherd bursting from an old ventilation opening halfway up a rocky ridge. Atlas emerged scratched, filthy, and bleeding from both front paws. He paused only long enough to catch Wyatt's scent carried on the cold mountain air. Then he turned toward the distant ridgeline, toward the only man who still knew every forgotten trail through these mountains. And he ran. Atlas ignored the blood collecting beneath his front paws. Branches lashed against his sides as he disappeared through thick rhododendron and towering hemlocks. He never followed the logging road. Instead, instinct and memory carried him along narrow game trails, across shallow creeks, and over moss-covered boulders where human footprints rarely lingered. The mountain unfolded beneath him in steep ridges and hidden hollows. He never hesitated. Hours earlier, while Wyatt had explored the abandoned property, Atlas had wandered farther than usual. From a distant ridge he had caught the scent of horses, wood smoke, and an older man who carried the familiar smell of grease, iron, and earth. Atlas remembered it, not as danger, as calm. Now that scent became his only destination. Nearly 11 miles from Black Creek, an old cabin stood beside a weathered red barn. A split-rail fence enclosed a small pasture where two aging mules grazed quietly beneath the morning sun. Nolan Briggs was repairing a broken wagon wheel when he heard frantic barking echo through the valley. He looked up. Atlas burst from the trees without slowing. The old German shepherd stumbled once, recovered, and reached Nolan before collapsing onto one knee. The dog's chest rose and fell violently. Blood stained both front paws. Nolan set the hammer down immediately. Easy now. Atlas didn't settle. He grabbed the cuff of Nolan's denim jacket with remarkable care and pulled. Once, then again. The old man studied him for several seconds. Most people would have reached for a phone. Nolan looked instead at the dog's eyes. He had spent 40 years reading men inside collapsing minds. Fear had a language. So did urgency. "You need me." Atlas barked once. Nolan nodded slowly. "I figured." Without another question, he disappeared into the barn. Within minutes, he emerged carrying climbing rope, a pulley, a first aid satchel, 2 canteens, and an old carbide headlamp whose brass housing had been polished so often it still gleamed despite its age. He paused only long enough to saddle his bay horse. Atlas had already started back toward the mountains. "Lead on." The old horse struggled to match the dog's relentless pace. Nolan had lived on these ridges since boyhood. Before becoming chief engineer at Black Creek Mine, he had explored nearly every ravine and forgotten trail. Even after the mine shut down, he continued walking the mountains because they were quieter than empty rooms after his wife passed away. He recognized where Atlas was taking him long before they arrived. "No." His voice barely carried above the wind. "The old north shaft." Nobody had entered that section in decades. The county had declared it too unstable. The closer they came, the more disturbed the forest appeared. Fresh boot prints, broken brush, truck tire tracks. Someone else had been here recently. Atlas disappeared over a rocky rise. Nolan followed. The abandoned shaft yawned before them like an open wound in the mountainside. The old man removed his hat. "Damn fools." He knelt beside the edge. Fresh scrape marks, loose stones. Someone had gone over. Not fallen. Gone over. Atlas stood at the rim, whining softly, looking down, looking back at Nolan. Again and again, the message was painfully clear. Nolan secured the climbing rope around the trunk of an ancient white oak. His weathered hands tied the knots automatically. Years underground had taught him one rule: never trust old rope. Never trust old timber. Always trust the knot you tie yourself. He clipped the harness around his waist. "You stay here." Atlas ignored him. The dog stepped onto the narrow descent carved into the rock face decades earlier by miners. Nolan sighed. "All right." Together they descended. The hidden trail zigzagged along the wall of the shaft, nearly invisible beneath vines and fallen stone. Few people knew it existed anymore. It had once served as an emergency escape route before a collapse sealed most of the lower tunnels. Nearly 40 minutes later, Atlas suddenly bolted ahead. Nolan heard him barking before he saw Wyatt. The veteran lay unconscious against a stone wall inside the hidden chamber, one hand still resting on the open engineer's journal. Atlas pressed his muzzle beneath Wyatt's shoulder, trying again to lift him. "It wasn't enough, was it, boy?" Nolan knelt immediately, 2 fingers against Wyatt's neck. Pulse. Weak, but steady. Bruised ribs, head wound, severe dehydration, no obvious spinal injury. Lucky. Luckier than most. As Nolan reached for the canteen, Wyatt suddenly inhaled sharply. His eyes flew open. For one terrible second, they weren't focused on the chamber. They looked straight through Nolan. "Contact left!" Wyatt swung wildly before freezing halfway through the motion. His breathing accelerated. Sweat poured across his forehead. Atlas immediately climbed beside him, pressing his entire body against Wyatt's shoulder. The trembling slowly eased. Wyatt blinked several times before recognition returned. "Where?" "You've been underground a while." Wyatt rubbed his eyes. "I thought I heard mortars?" Wyatt stared. Nolan quietly uncorked the canteen. "My younger brother came home from Vietnam, hearing helicopters that weren't there." He handed Wyatt the water. "I learned not to ask too many questions." Wyatt drank slowly. Every swallow hurt. Atlas rested his head across Wyatt's boot. Only then did Nolan notice the dog's paws. The pads had been sliced open by sharp shale during the desperate run. Fresh blood still seeped between his toes. "You did all this for him?" Atlas looked up but never moved away from Wyatt. Nolan smiled sadly. "I've known men with less loyalty." While Wyatt recovered enough strength to stand, Nolan examined the hidden chamber. His expression changed the moment he saw the engineering journal. Then the survey maps. Then the government seals. His weathered face turned pale. "I don't believe it." Wyatt looked over. "You know what these are?" Nolan carefully lifted one of the maps as though afraid it might crumble. "I've spent 30 years wondering what happened to these records." He turned another page. His breathing slowed. "I thought they were destroyed after the Black Creek collapse." Wyatt frowned. "They weren't." "No." Nolan looked around the forgotten room. They were hidden. Silence settled over the chamber. Far above them, the mountain stood exactly as it had for 100 years, keeping its secret, waiting for someone willing to survive long enough to finally listen. The climb out of the abandoned mine took nearly 4 exhausting hours. Nolan led the way through narrow service passages that only an engineer would have remembered. More than once, he stopped to test old timbers with the handle of his shovel before waving Wyatt forward. Atlas refused to leave Wyatt's side, limping despite the cuts across his paws. By late afternoon, they reached Nolan's cabin. It sat alone at the edge of a broad mountain meadow where wildflowers pushed through weathered fence rails. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. The place carried the quiet order of a man who had spent years living with memories instead of conversation. Wyatt barely made it through the front door. The warmth of the cabin hit him first. Then the smell of fresh coffee, pine wood, and old leather. Nolan pointed toward a narrow bedroom. "Lie down. I'm fine. You've got a concussion, bruised ribs, and enough dehydration to make a mule fall over." Wyatt considered arguing. Instead, he lowered himself carefully onto the bed. Atlas curled beside it without hesitation. Only after Wyatt rested a hand on the dog's neck did Atlas finally close his eyes. Nolan cleaned the cuts on the dog's paws before treating Wyatt's injuries. Neither man spoke much. Silence never felt awkward between men who had both learned that pain usually arrived without needing words. That night, rain tapped softly against the tin roof. Wyatt woke instantly. His heart was already racing before he understood why. A loose shutter slammed against the cabin wall. Bang! Another gust. Bang! The sharp rhythm became something else. Vehicle doors. Gunfire. The thunder rolling across the mountains became distant artillery. He was back inside a dusty compound outside Kandahar. Someone shouted his name. Another ranger dropped beside a broken wall. Blood. Smoke. The smell of burned diesel. Wyatt sat upright so violently the blanket fell to the floor. His breathing shortened. His eyes darted toward every corner of the room, searching for exits before his mind caught up with reality. Atlas was already there. The German shepherd rested both front paws gently across Wyatt's knees. No barking. No panic, only steady pressure, grounding him. Wyatt focused on the dog's breathing. One slow inhale, one slow exhale. His own breathing gradually matched it. The storm outside became rain again. The war faded. Nolan appeared quietly in the doorway carrying 2 steaming mugs. "I figured that one would wake you." Wyatt rubbed his face. "Sorry. No reason to apologize." Nolan handed him coffee before taking the old rocking chair beside the window. "My wife used to say, storms bring back whatever a man hasn't buried." Wyatt stared into the dark liquid. "I've tried burying plenty." Nolan looked toward the rain. "So did I." Neither explained further. They didn't have to. Morning arrived wrapped in mountain fog. Atlas insisted on following Wyatt outside despite the bandages around his paws. The dog walked more slowly now, favoring his right front leg, but his eyes never drifted far from Wyatt. The cabin overlooked the valley below. From the porch, they could see the rooftops of Black Creek in the distance. Peaceful, ordinary, almost beautiful. It was difficult to imagine that something terrible had once happened beneath those hills. After breakfast, Nolan spread the recovered maps across his kitchen table. The engineer's journal lay open beside them. Its brittle pages crackled softly every time they turned another sheet. Wyatt read aloud. March 18th, 1924. Excessive groundwater entering the North Galleries. Nolan nodded. I remember hearing old miners mention that spring system. Another page. Management rejected reinforcement requests due to cost. Another. Pressure readings continue rising. Nolan's jaw tightened. They knew. Wyatt looked up. They knew the tunnels were failing. They knew. The old engineer reached for a rolled survey map. When he spread it open, faded blue lines crossed the mountain like veins beneath skin. He traced one with a calloused finger. This isn't just a mine. Wyatt leaned closer. It's an underground aquifer. Nolan nodded slowly. The biggest freshwater system in this part of the county. Wyatt frowned. Why hide it? Because whoever controlled this water. Nolan paused. Controlled every farm, every mill, every future development in Black Creek. Silence settled over the room. Atlas suddenly raised his head. His ears turned toward the front porch. Not alarm. Attention. A vehicle. Far away. Engine noise drifted faintly through the open window before disappearing again. Wyatt instinctively folded the maps. You expecting company? Nolan shook his head. No. Wyatt crossed quietly to the porch. The dirt road below looked empty. Too empty. He noticed fresh tire impressions in yesterday's mud. Not Nolan's truck. Different tread. Newer. Someone had driven up the mountain, stopped, then backed away, watching, without knocking. His stomach tightened. He stepped back inside. We're not the only ones looking anymore. Nolan followed his gaze to the tracks. They've started searching. Wyatt carefully placed the journal back inside the steel lockbox. If Preston Hale wanted me dead. He looked toward Atlas. Why send men after papers instead of finishing the job? Neither answered. The journal lying between them already contained the truth. They simply hadn't reached the right page yet. Outside, hidden beyond the tree line overlooking the cabin, a pair of binoculars lowered slowly. A man climbed back into a black pickup without starting the engine. He took one final photograph through the windshield. The old cabin. The veteran. The dog. Then he reached for the radio. I found them. The reply came almost immediately. Don't engage. A pause. Just tell Mr. Hale they opened the chamber. The radio clicked off. Cole Maddox lowered the binoculars and remained perfectly still inside the black pickup. Years spent working private security had taught him one rule above all others. Watch first, move later. He studied the cabin one last time before backing down the narrow logging road without spinning the tires. He left almost no fresh tracks behind. Back at the cabin, Wyatt was already uneasy. He stood beside the porch rail, scanning the distant tree line the way he once searched rooftops before entering unfamiliar villages overseas. Nothing moved. That bothered him more than movement ever did. Atlas limped onto the porch and quietly rested beside Wyatt's boot. The German shepherd's ears rotated independently. Listening. Always listening. You see something? Nolan asked. I don't know. Wyatt narrowed his eyes. It feels wrong. He couldn't explain it. Combat had rewired parts of his mind that words never seemed able to reach. Sometimes danger announced itself long before evidence appeared. Sometimes it arrived as silence. That evening, Nolan locked the steel box inside an old cast-iron safe hidden beneath loose floorboards. The journals, the maps, the government records, everything disappeared beneath the cabin floor. "If anybody comes looking," Nolan said, "they won't find them easily." Wyatt nodded. "But they'll keep looking." Night settled over the mountains. Clouds covered the moon. The cabin disappeared into complete darkness except for the faint orange glow inside the wood stove. Neither man slept well. Around 2 in the morning, Atlas's nose touched Wyatt's hand. Not hard. Just enough. Wyatt's eyes opened instantly. The dog wasn't barking. That alone was enough. Atlas only stayed silent when he believed noise would help the enemy more than his owner. Wyatt remained lying exactly where he was, listening. Wind. Rain dripping from leaves. Then, a floorboard outside. Very soft. Someone was on the porch. He slowly reached beneath the bed and wrapped his fingers around the heavy flashlight Nolan had left there. His breathing slowed. In. Out. He counted. 1, 2, 3. Another sound. Metal. The faint scrape of something touching the front door, not forcing it, testing it. Wyatt rose silently. Atlas never moved ahead. He stayed at Wyatt's left knee exactly as he had during countless search exercises. Wyatt glanced toward the oil lamp burning low on the kitchen table. The flame leaned sharply for just an instant. A draft. The window. Someone had opened it. His eyes shifted without moving his head. A shadow crossed the glass. "There. Outside," he whispered. "Back." Atlas immediately stepped behind the kitchen island. Wyatt waited another heartbeat before moving. He reached the window in 3 silent steps, then swung the door open. The figure bolted. Black jacket, dark cap, medium build, already sprinting toward the trees. Wyatt followed. His ribs protested every stride. Pain didn't matter. The distance did. The intruder knew exactly where he was going. No hesitation. No wrong turns. Atlas surged past Wyatt despite the bandages around his paws. The German shepherd closed the gap astonishingly fast. The fleeing man glanced over one shoulder. Bad mistake. Atlas launched, his jaws clamped firmly around the man's forearm. Not tearing, holding, exactly as trained. The man cried out and stumbled to one knee. For one brief second, Wyatt thought they had him. Steel flashed beneath the trees, a folding knife. The blade swept downward. Atlas released instantly as instinct demanded. Even so, the knife sliced across his shoulder before the dog twisted away. A sharp yelp shattered the night. "Atlas!" The man kicked free and disappeared into dense laurel thickets before Wyatt could catch him. Silence returned almost immediately. Only Atlas remained. Standing, breathing hard. Blood darkened the fur across his right shoulder. Wyatt dropped beside him. "Easy, buddy." Atlas leaned against him, but never looked away from the woods. Still guarding, still working. Even injured. Back inside the cabin, Nolan cleaned the wound beneath a lantern, while Wyatt paced slowly across the room. The cut wasn't deep, painful, but clean. "He'll heal," Nolan said quietly. Wyatt nodded without speaking. His hand never left Atlas's neck. Finally, Nolan broke the silence. "Did he try to hurt you?" Wyatt looked toward the open floor where muddy boot prints stretched only a few feet into the cabin. "No." "What was he after?" Wyatt followed the tracks. They stopped directly above the loose floorboards hiding the safe. The intruder had ignored Nolan's wallet hanging beside the door. ignored the rifle over the fireplace, ignored cash sitting openly inside a ceramic jar. Only one place interested him: the documents. Nolan stared at the floor. They knew where to look. They knew enough. Wyatt crouched beside one muddy print. Deep heel, military-style boot. Size 11. Weight carried evenly. Professional, not local. He touched the damp soil left behind. Fresh clay. Gray. Not from Nolan's property. From the abandoned mine. Whoever had entered the cabin had already been back to Black Creek. He rose slowly. They aren't protecting land. Nolan looked up. They're protecting whatever those papers prove. Atlas lifted his head. His ears turned toward the darkness beyond the window once more. Far away. An engine started. It faded into the mountains, leaving only the quiet sound of rain falling across Appalachia. Wyatt stared after it for a long moment. They know we're alive now. Nolan closed the safe and slid the floorboards back into place. And next time... Neither man finished the sentence. Neither needed to. Outside, miles away, Preston Hale stood inside the office of his mining company, studying an old family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Cole Maddox entered without knocking. "The papers?" Cole shook his head. "The dog stopped me." Preston's expression remained calm. "What about the veteran? He knows the documents matter." For the first time that night, Preston's smile disappeared. He walked to the window overlooking the sleeping town. "My grandfather spent a lifetime making sure those records never saw daylight." He folded his hands behind his back. "We don't get a second chance to bury them." The morning broke under a blanket of low clouds that clung to the Appalachian ridges like smoke after a fire. Wyatt was already awake. He hadn't slept more than an hour. The knife attack had faded into another long night of broken dreams, each ending the same way, with someone calling for help just beyond reach. A kettle whistled softly on Nolan's old cast-iron stove. Neither man mentioned the events of the night before. Instead, Nolan placed the engineer's journal on the kitchen table. "If they're willing to risk coming here," he said quietly, "we'd better find out exactly what frightened them." Atlas limped over and settled beneath Wyatt's chair. The fresh bandage around his shoulder stood out against his dark coat, but his eyes remained alert, following every movement in the room. Wyatt opened the journal where they had stopped. The handwriting had changed again. The neat script of an engineer had become hurried, almost desperate. April 2nd, 1924. Management has ordered another blast despite repeated warnings. The north galleries are flooding faster than our pumps can keep up. Nolan slowly removed his glasses. "I've seen reports like this." Wyatt turned another page. "The spring beneath Black Creek is larger than any survey predicted. If the tunnel collapses, the entire western shaft will become a tomb." A heavy silence settled over the room. Outside, rain dripped steadily from the porch roof. Wyatt kept reading. "Mr. Hale insists production cannot stop. The investors arrive next month. He says replacing men is cheaper than rebuilding tunnels." Nolan closed his eyes. "My father worked this mine." Wyatt looked up. "He never talked about it?" "Only once." The old engineer stared through the rain toward the distant mountains. "He said there were men who went underground on a Thursday morning." His voice trailed away and never came home. He reached for another bundle tied with faded cotton string. County survey maps. Every page carried official seals. Wyatt carefully spread them across the table. The old mine tunnels stretched beneath the valley like veins beneath skin. Then he noticed something strange. One section had been covered by another sheet glued over the original. He slid his pocket knife carefully beneath the brittle paper. The layer peeled away. Beneath it appeared another drawing. Not a tunnel. A massive underground reservoir. Blue ink filled nearly an entire section beneath Black Creek. Nolan leaned closer. My God. He traced the outline with one finger. They erased it. Why? Because whoever owned this aquifer, he paused, owned every future well in the county, every farm, every ranch, every new subdivision, every business, everything depended on water. Wyatt remembered Preston Hale's first offer, $50,000, not for abandoned land, for silence. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. He crossed the room without making a sound. Instead of barking, he stopped beside the stack of unopened crates recovered from the hidden chamber. His nose rested against one corner. Then he pawed it once. Wyatt smiled faintly. You found something else. The crate had swollen from decades of moisture. Together they pried the lid loose. Inside lay dozens of tightly rolled blueprints protected inside waxed canvas. Beneath them rested a flat leather document case. The clasp had turned green with age. Wyatt opened it carefully. Inside were original land deeds. Each carried official state signatures, one after another. Then something unexpected. A thin envelope marked, Confidential United States Geological Survey, 1924. Wyatt unfolded the letter. Its edges cracked softly. The words remained clear. The freshwater reserve beneath Black Creek is of exceptional strategic importance. Federal acquisition is recommended. Another page followed. This information is not to be released until ownership disputes are resolved. Nolan slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair. It never reached Washington. Wyatt frowned. What makes you say that? Because if it had, he looked toward the mountains. The government would have protected it. Instead, someone had hidden it. Atlas continued sniffing through the crate. He paused again, this time beside a narrow compartment built into the bottom. Wyatt almost missed it. A false floor. Using the knife blade, he lifted the thin wooden panel. Inside rested a small metal cylinder sealed with wax. Government property. Neither man spoke. Wyatt carefully broke the seal. Folded documents slid into his hands. Typed. Official. Signed. Not by mining executives, by federal inspectors. The final report left no room for doubt. Cause of collapse. Unauthorized explosive charges ordered despite engineering objections. Flooding from the primary aquifer trapped 38 miners underground. Evidence indicates company management knowingly accepted fatal risk. Below the signatures appeared one familiar name, Harold Hale, Preston Hale's grandfather, responsible executive. No wonder someone had hidden the records. This wasn't negligence. It was proof. Proof that an entire company had knowingly buried 38 men alive. Wyatt looked back toward the engineer's journal. The final pages had been written in a trembling hand. If anyone finds these papers, tell the families the men did not die because of the mountain. They died because someone chose profit over people. The room became impossibly quiet. Only the ticking of Nolan's old wall clock remained. Wyatt swallowed hard. My grandfather found this. Nolan nodded slowly, and spent the rest of his life protecting it. He never told anyone. Maybe he tried. The thought lingered between them. Atlas suddenly returned from the doorway, carrying something clenched gently between his teeth. Not a stick, not a boot, a weathered leather wallet half buried beneath leaves outside the cabin. Wyatt took it. Inside lay an old photograph stained by water. Several miners stood shoulder to shoulder outside Black Creek Mine. On the back, someone had written in faded pencil, For those who survive, tell the truth. Wyatt stared at the faces. One of them looked astonishingly familiar. The same eyes, the same jawline. His grandfather, much younger, standing beside Chief Engineer Elias Mercer. At that moment, Wyatt finally understood. His inheritance had never been 37 acres. It had been a promise carried through one family for 100 years, waiting for someone willing to finish what another man had been forced to leave undone. Wyatt folded the photograph with the care of a man handling something far more valuable than paper. His grandfather had carried the truth. Now it belonged to him. The realization settled heavily across the cabin. Not like a burden, like a mission. Atlas rested his head against Wyatt's knee, sensing the long silence that followed. The German shepherd's bandaged shoulder twitched once, but he never complained. His eyes stayed fixed on Wyatt, as though waiting for the next command. Nolan quietly gathered the documents into 3 separate bundles. "If something happens," he said, "never keep everything together." Wyatt looked up. "You expecting company? I've spent enough years around mines to know when the mountain starts talking." He wrapped the engineer's journal in oilcloth. "And it's talking loud." By noon, the clouds had thickened into a heavy gray ceiling. The air felt strangely still. Even the birds had disappeared. Wyatt stepped onto the porch. His ranger instincts tugged at him again. No movement. No sound. Too clean. He walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing. Atlas followed despite the stiffness in his shoulder. Halfway to the tree line, the dog suddenly stopped. His ears locked forward. Not barking. Listening. Wyatt crouched beside him. Broken fern. Fresh mud. A boot print. Large. Military tread. Not Nolan's. He touched the impression. Still damp. Less than an hour old. "They're here." Atlas gave the faintest growl. Wyatt immediately scanned the ridges. 1, 2, 3 likely observation points. If he were planning an ambush, he wouldn't come from the road. He'd use elevation. He quietly backed toward the cabin. Nolan. The old engineer appeared in the doorway. "Get the documents." Nolan saw Wyatt's face. He asked no questions. Within seconds, he disappeared beneath the loose floorboards. Wyatt removed 3 bundles from the safe. One contained the original records. The other 2 were wrapped in blank paper. Decoys. He slid the real documents into a weatherproof pack and handed it to Nolan. "If we get separated..." "I know." The old man nodded. "I head east. You don't stop." Outside, Atlas suddenly barked. One sharp warning. A gunshot cracked through the trees. The front porch railing exploded into splinters. Another shot. Lower, closer. "They're pinning us!" Wyatt pulled Nolan behind the stone chimney. "Stay down." He never fired back. He hadn't even brought a rifle outside. This wasn't a fight to win. It was a fight to survive. Another voice echoed from the forest. "Wyatt!" Cole Maddox stepped from behind an oak tree nearly 70 yards away. Hands visible. Rifle lowered. "You don't have to die over old paper." Wyatt stayed behind cover. "You already tried that." Cole smiled faintly. "This isn't personal. It became personal when your boss threw me into a mine." The smile disappeared. Rain began falling, slowly at first, then harder. Dark clouds swallowed the afternoon light. Cole glanced toward the sky. "We're running out of time." "So are you." Wyatt watched Atlas. The dog's attention wasn't on Cole. It was fixed farther uphill. Another team, flanking. Exactly what Wyatt would have done. "Left side," he whispered. Atlas immediately shifted, without barking, without hesitation. 3 armed men emerged from the trees. Wyatt grabbed Nolan's sleeve. "Move!" The old engineer didn't argue. They slipped through the back of the cabin just as another bullet shattered the kitchen window. Rain became a downpour. Within minutes, the narrow mountain trail turned slick with mud. Atlas ran ahead despite his injured shoulder. Every few yards he stopped, looked back, waited, then continued. "He knows where he's going," Nolan shouted over the storm. "He always does." Thunder rolled across the valley. The mountain answered with another sound. A deep rumble. Not thunder. Rock. Wyatt stopped instantly. Landslide. Where? Before Nolan could answer, Atlas veered sharply away from the main trail, straight into dense laurel. The old engineer frowned. "That's not the path." Wyatt trusted the dog. "Follow him." Behind them came shouting. Cole's men had realized they were escaping. Boots pounded through the mud. Branches snapped. The chase tightened. Atlas burst through thick brush and disappeared beneath a rocky overhang. Wyatt followed. A narrow opening, barely visible. Another forgotten mining entrance. Nolan stared in disbelief. "I worked here 30 years and never knew this existed." The tunnel sloped sharply downward. Rainwater poured inside like a stream. Behind them, Cole's voice echoed. "They're in the tunnel!" Wyatt didn't stop moving. Neither did Atlas. The German shepherd suddenly barked twice. Urgent. Warning. Wyatt lifted his flashlight. Water. Fast-moving water rushed through the lower passage. The storm above had awakened the mountain. Ancient drainage tunnels were filling. Nolan's face turned pale. The whole system, he looked uphill toward the darkness, is about to flood. At that exact moment, Cole appeared at the tunnel entrance with 2 armed men. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The roar of rising water filled every corner of the mine. There were no good choices left. Only one way forward. Deeper into the mountain. Together. Hunter and hunted. Because behind them stood armed men. Ahead of them, the mountain itself was beginning to wake. The first surge of water burst through the lower tunnel with the force of a freight train. Wyatt didn't hesitate. "Move!" Atlas sprang forward despite the fresh wound on his shoulder, disappearing into the darkness before stopping just long enough to look back. He barked once, short, sharp, certain. That was enough. Wyatt trusted the dog more than the map in his own memory. The 4 men scattered in different directions as muddy water slammed into the chamber behind them. Lantern light vanished beneath the flood, and the tunnel filled with the grinding roar of broken timber and rolling stone. Cole Maddox lost his footing first. The current swept his rifle away, spinning it into the darkness. He crashed against a support beam, barely managing to wrap one arm around it before the water tried to tear him loose. One of the gunmen disappeared completely. His shout echoed only once before the mountain swallowed it. The second man scrambled toward higher ground, abandoning his weapon without looking back. Wyatt grabbed Nolan's arm. "This way!" Atlas had found a narrow ledge running above the flooded passage, little more than a shelf carved into solid rock generations earlier. Wyatt recognized its purpose immediately. Emergency maintenance access, built before modern safety standards, forgotten by almost everyone. The 4 survivors climbed one behind another while the flood churned below. Every step demanded absolute focus. Loose shale shifted beneath their boots. The roar of water drowned every other sound. Halfway across, a thunderous crack echoed through the tunnel. One of the ancient support posts snapped. The ceiling trembled. Dust poured down like gray rain. "We've got seconds!" Nolan shouted. Atlas suddenly stopped. His ears locked forward. Then he turned back toward Wyatt instead of continuing. The dog barked twice. Not warning. Insistence. Wyatt swept his flashlight across the darkness. There. Cole. He was no longer clinging to the beam. The current had dragged him against a collapsed ore cart, where twisted steel trapped one leg beneath rushing water. Cole struggled wildly. The more he fought, the deeper the metal pinned him. He looked up for the first time since Wyatt had met him. There was no arrogance, only fear. "Leave him," Nolan yelled. "If we stop, the tunnel comes down." Wyatt stared at Cole for one long second. Another memory flashed through him. Afghanistan. A young ranger trapped beneath shattered concrete after an IED blast. Wyatt had reached him too late. For years afterward, that face had visited every nightmare. He looked at Atlas. The German shepherd never moved, never barked again. Just watched. Waiting. Decision made. Wyatt dropped to one knee beside the flooded cart. "Nolan, hold the rope. You'll die. Not today." He clipped the rescue rope around his waist. The icy water hit him like a hammer as he slid onto the lower ledge. Cole's face had turned pale. "Why are you helping me?" Wyatt wedged his shoulder beneath the twisted steel. "Because somebody once tried to help me." He pushed. Nothing. Again. The beam shifted barely an inch. Pain shot through his bruised ribs. Atlas suddenly leaped down beside him. The dog planted all four paws against the ore cart and shoved with everything he had. The movement wasn't enough to free the steel, but it changed the angle. Wyatt heaved one final time. The metal rolled. Cole's leg came free. "Go!" The three men scrambled toward higher ground just as another section of ceiling collapsed behind them. The tunnel disappeared beneath tons of rock. They collapsed onto a dry platform carved into the mountainside. No one spoke for nearly a minute, only breathing. Only the distant roar of floodwater fading deeper underground. Atlas limped to Wyatt and rested his head against his chest. His shoulder wound had opened again. Fresh blood soaked the bandage. Wyatt stroked the dog's neck. "You stubborn old soldier." Atlas closed his eyes for a moment. Cole sat against the wall, staring silently at the place where he should have died. Finally, he looked toward Wyatt. "You could have left me." "I know. You should have." Wyatt said nothing. The silence weighed more heavily than any accusation. Cole lowered his head. "I spent 10 years telling myself Preston Hale was just protecting his family's business." He laughed bitterly. "I lied to myself." Nolan watched him carefully. "What business?" Cole looked at the flooded tunnel. "The Hale family has been stealing land for generations." He swallowed hard. Anyone who refused to sell eventually lost everything. Wyatt remained still. Cole continued. "Your grandfather wasn't the first." The words hung in the cold air. There were fires, forged deeds, threats, people who disappeared. Cole's voice grew quieter. The mine records were the only proof tying it all together. He looked directly at Wyatt. "That's why Preston wanted you dead before you ever read them." Wyatt reached slowly into his jacket. His small digital recorder, waterproof, battered from years of travel, still worked. Without a word, he pressed the red button. The tiny light blinked. Cole noticed. For the first time in years, he stopped protecting Preston Hale. He told them everything. Names, dates, hidden payments, destroyed county records, bribes, threats, every secret he had carried. When he finally finished, no one spoke. Atlas suddenly stood. The dog limped back toward the edge of the flooded passage where muddy water still rushed beneath broken timbers. His nose disappeared beneath a fallen beam. Then he pulled, hard. The waterproof pack. The one containing every original document. It had nearly been carried away forever. Atlas dragged it across the stone inch by inch, despite the pain in his shoulder, until it reached Wyatt's boots. Wyatt knelt beside him. For a long moment, he simply rested his forehead against Atlas's. Outside, the storm finally began to drift east. Far above them, sunlight pierced the clouds for the first time that day. Behind them, another deep rumble echoed through the mountain. The old tunnel was collapsing for good. There would be no second chance to recover what remained inside. Fortunately, they no longer needed it. The mountain had kept its promise, and now, it had finally given them a living witness. The rain had stopped by the time Wyatt, Nolan, Atlas, and Cole emerged from the mountain. The forest smelled of wet pine, fresh earth, and broken stone. Behind them, the last echoes of the collapsing tunnel rolled beneath the ridges until the mountains became quiet again. Wyatt looked back only once. The entrance was gone. Nature had sealed the mine forever. Whatever remained inside would stay buried for another century. It no longer mattered. Everything they truly needed was already in the waterproof pack slung across Wyatt's shoulder. Atlas limped beside him, exhausted, but refusing to fall behind. His bandaged shoulder was stained with fresh blood, yet every few steps he glanced toward Wyatt, making sure his partner was still there. Nolan finally broke the silence. "We don't go back to Black Creek." Cole nodded immediately. "If Preston still has friends in the sheriff's office, you'll disappear before sunset." Wyatt had already reached the same conclusion. Years in uniform had taught him one lesson that mattered now more than ever. Never hand evidence to the people your enemy already controls. "We go federal." No one argued. The drive east took nearly 6 hours. Nolan's old pickup rattled along winding mountain roads before joining the interstate toward Asheville. Wyatt sat in the passenger seat with the waterproof case resting on his lap the entire time. He never once let go of the shoulder strap. Atlas slept with his head against Wyatt's leg, occasionally twitching as dreams pulled him somewhere only dogs could understand. Twice, Wyatt caught himself reaching toward the dashboard whenever an oncoming truck flashed its headlights. For a split second, the white glare became the blinding flash of an explosion outside Kandahar. His breathing tightened. Atlas stirred immediately. Without opening his eyes, the German shepherd pressed one paw gently against Wyatt's boot. The memory dissolved. Wyatt rested his hand on the dog's neck. "Thanks, partner." Late that afternoon, they pulled into the federal building. Unlike the county offices in Black Creek, nobody recognized Preston Hale's name here. Nobody lowered their voices. Nobody looked afraid. United States Marshal Owen Carter met them himself. He was a broad-shouldered man, with silver hair, and the steady eyes of someone who had spent decades separating facts from stories. He listened without interrupting. Wyatt laid the engineer's journal on the table, then the maps, then the federal inspection report. Finally, he placed the digital recorder beside them. Cole looked at the recorder for a long moment, then quietly nodded. "Play it." His own voice filled the room. Calm, detailed, unavoidable. He described forged deeds, illegal land seizures, bribes paid to county officials, the attempted murder inside the abandoned mine, and Preston Hale's direct orders. Nobody spoke while the recording played. When it ended, Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Sloan entered carrying a legal pad already filled with notes. She examined the documents one by one. Cotton gloves protected the brittle pages. She paused over the original federal inspection report. The signatures match archived government records. She looked toward Wyatt. "This is authentic." Marshal Carter turned toward Cole. "Are you willing to repeat everything you just admitted under oath?" Cole swallowed. "I am." "And testify in federal court?" "Yes." The marshal nodded once. "Then this investigation begins today." Within hours, federal agents were moving. Search warrants, property seizures, financial records, county archives, everything connected to Preston Hale's company. Word traveled through Black Creek faster than the convoy itself. People gathered quietly along Main Street as unmarked government vehicles rolled into town. No sirens, no speeches, only quiet determination. Preston Hale stepped from his office just as two federal marshals approached. He smiled at first. The smile disappeared when he recognized Owen Carter, even more when he saw Wyatt standing across the street beside Nolan. Atlas sat calmly at Wyatt's side despite the bandage around his shoulder. Preston's eyes drifted toward the German shepherd. For the first time since they had met, there was uncertainty. "You should have stayed dead," Preston said quietly. Wyatt answered just as softly. "My grandfather tried to tell the truth." He looked toward the old courthouse. "I'm just finishing the job." Marshal Carter unfolded the warrant. "Preston Hale, you're under arrest on federal charges, including conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud, obstruction of justice, and offenses related to falsified land records." The street became completely silent. Shop owners stepped onto sidewalks. Retired miners removed worn baseball caps. Several elderly women began crying before anyone had been placed in handcuffs. One old man whispered only 3 words. "My daddy knew." Preston looked around as though expecting someone to stop the arrest. No one moved. Not the sheriff, not the town council, not the businessmen who had spent years praising him. His empire had depended on silence. Silence had finally abandoned him. As the marshal guided Preston toward the waiting vehicle, he glanced once more at Wyatt. "You think this changes anything?" Wyatt watched the handcuffs click shut. It already has. Days later, forensic teams entered the sealed county archives. Engineers confirmed the existence of the underground aquifer. Historians matched every recovered document to surviving state records. Families whose fathers and grandfathers had vanished in the 1924 collapse finally received official confirmation that the disaster had never been an accident. Outside a veterinary clinic in Asheville, Wyatt sat quietly on a wooden bench while Atlas rested beside him, with a fresh bandage across his shoulder. The veterinarian smiled as she handed Wyatt the discharge papers. "He'll carry a scar." Wyatt gently scratched behind Atlas's ears. "So will I." Atlas leaned into his hand. Neither of them seemed to mind anymore. For the first time in years, Wyatt realized he wasn't waiting for the next fight. He was waiting for tomorrow. Spring arrived slowly in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The last patches of winter frost disappeared beneath carpets of wildflowers, and the narrow creek that had once flowed unseen beneath the abandoned mine now ran freely through Wyatt Brennan's land. For the first time in 100 years, the water reached the surface without being hidden behind lies, forged deeds, or locked gates. The newspapers called it the Black Creek Scandal. Federal investigators called it one of the oldest land fraud cases in North Carolina history. The families of the 38 miners called it something much simpler: the truth. One by one, descendants traveled back to the valley carrying faded photographs, worn Bibles, and stories handed down through generations. They stood together near the old mining ridge while new granite markers were placed with every miner's name finally carved into stone. Wyatt stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. He never stepped to the podium, never sought a camera. He had spent enough years trying to disappear from the world to know that healing rarely happened in front of an audience. Atlas sat beside him, the white scar crossing his right shoulder, now visible beneath his thick coat. The veterinarian had assured Wyatt the injury would never slow him down again. She had been right. The dog watched every family as though keeping guard over them all. Nolan Briggs removed his hat when the final name was read aloud. His eyes never left the memorial. "I should have come back years ago," he said. Wyatt shook his head. "You came when it mattered." The old engineer smiled faintly. "Maybe these mountains were waiting for the right people." Construction began early that summer. The abandoned mining office was carefully dismantled, its weathered lumber reused wherever possible. Instead of another company building, a modest log cabin rose beside the restored spring. No gates, no fences keeping people away. Just a porch facing the mountains. Neighbors who had once avoided Wyatt now arrived carrying tools instead of questions. A retired carpenter framed the roof. 2 former miners rebuilt the stone chimney. Local ranchers hauled lumber without asking for payment. Nobody spoke much about Preston Hale anymore. His chapter had ended. This one belonged to the people who remained. A few weeks later, Nolan handed Wyatt an old wooden sign he had carved by hand. The letters were deep and clean. Brennan Ridge. Veterans and working dogs. Wyatt ran his fingers across the fresh cedar. You made this? Nolan shrugged. My wife always said every place deserves a proper name. Together they raised the sign beside the gravel road leading to the cabin. Atlas immediately walked over, sniffed the post, and settled beneath it as though approving the decision. The program began with only 3 veterans. One had slept beneath highway bridges for nearly a year. Another hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since returning home. The third arrived carrying a folded flag and a grief he never tried to explain. Wyatt didn't ask them to tell their stories. Instead, he introduced them to the dogs. They repaired fences, cleared trails, learned search and rescue commands, walked the mountains at sunrise. Sometimes healing arrived through conversation. More often, it arrived through quiet companionship. Atlas became the first instructor. The old German shepherd patiently demonstrated every command, every search pattern, every silent signal Wyatt had taught him over the years. Even with the scar across his shoulder, Atlas moved with calm confidence. The younger dogs followed him instinctively. So did the men. One crisp autumn morning, Wyatt woke before dawn. For a moment, he lay perfectly still. The cabin creaked softly as the wind moved through the pines. Years earlier, that sound would have sent his heart racing. Today, he simply listened. No explosions, no shouting, no distant helicopters, just the creek, the birds, and Atlas's steady breathing beside the bed. The dog stood first and walked to the front door. Wyatt smiled. Yeah, I know. Outside, golden light filtered through the trees. Atlas trotted toward the old forest trail, where he had once disappeared to save Wyatt's life. He paused at the edge of the woods, looked back over his shoulder, and waited. Just as he always had. Wyatt followed. They walked side by side beneath towering oaks until they reached the ridge overlooking the valley. Below them, the restored creek shimmered through the morning sun. Children laughed near the training field. A search and rescue class was beginning. Smoke curled gently from the cabin chimney. Life had returned to ground that everyone had once called worthless. Wyatt slipped one hand into his jacket pocket. Inside rested the faded photograph of his grandfather, standing beside the chief engineer, Elias Mercer. He looked toward the mountains. You kept your promise, he said quietly. A cool breeze carried through the pines as though answering him. Atlas leaned gently against Wyatt's leg. For years, Wyatt had believed his grandfather had left him 37 forgotten acres. He understood now how wrong he had been. The land had only been the doorway. The hidden chamber had only been the key. The real inheritance was the chance to give forgotten people another beginning. As the sun climbed higher over Appalachia, Wyatt and Atlas started back toward the cabin together, their long shadows stretching across the trail behind them. They had entered these mountains searching for a place to survive. They left them having built a place where others could finally come home. If Wyatt and Atlas's journey meant something to you, leave a simple one in the comments. It may be just one number, but it tells us this story found its way to someone who understands courage, loyalty, and second chances. And if you believe every forgotten hero deserves to have their story told, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. More unforgettable stories of veterans, faithful dogs, hidden truths, and extraordinary hope are waiting just ahead. Until next time, take care of the people who stand beside you, because sometimes one loyal companion can change an entire life. We'll see you in the next story.